Hi everyone and welcome to Asami Rat Care. So today's video is going to be on genetic side of things, and it's going to be looking at inbreeding versus outcrossing, and it's actually going to aim to clear up a little bit of the myths that surround both of those things. They're quite interesting topics, and they're both very useful tools in any breeder's arsenal. And it's important that as breeders we understand how to use them, but it's actually also interesting as a pet owner to understand how breeders use them, because there's a lot of stigma particularly attached around inbreeding, partly because of the way it's gone with dogs. So we all know with dogs that some of them have been bred to the extreme, and I will say extremes are dangerous. So they've been bred to the point where the noses are so short they can't breathe properly, and where kind of deformities kick in and that kind of thing. And this is something that we obviously as kind of breeders need to understand and need to avoid. But the secret is not the fact that they were inbred. Inbreeding is basically just a case of selecting two closely related animals and breeding them together. And the reason it is useful, and the reason that it's something that all breeders that know what they're doing do use, and I will say not exclusively, but the reason it's so useful is because it shows you what you've got. So all inbreeding is you're taking two sets of genetics, and we've talked a little bit about the kind of obvious genetic stuff like the colour of the rat, the eye colour and that kind of thing, but actually every little rat is just a load of information held on the DNA from the kind of sorry, they've just knocked something off. It was getting drowning in the pea fishing pond. So a bag of basically genetic information that programs how they're built, but we can only see a very small fraction of it, as I talked in the kind of like genetics for kind of basics side of thing. And what we need to find as breeders is all the stuff we can't see, and some of that stuff will be good stuff. Some of that will be like this rat is really resistant to certain things, so it doesn't get tumours very often, it's very resistant to respiratory problems, it might live really long time, it might be really super friendly. There's all these elements that we can't immediately see, but then there's also bad stuff as well. So you can get things like kind of temperament issues, getting hormonal. You can get health issues, so you can get predisposed towards respiratory problems or towards getting certain types of tumours, and all of this kind of adds up together, and we need to be selecting for all those positive traits, and we need to be selecting away from all the negative traits, and that's where it's really, really important. So as breeders, everything we do in terms of kind of really working with a line is to select for the positives and select away from the negatives. And the most powerful tool you can do to do that is inbreeding, and the reason is because you're taking two rats with very similar genetic information. You might not be able to see all of it, but by putting them together you increase the chances of, let's say if it's the kind of gene like a recessive gene that needs two copies to show, so you put two quite closely related rats together, you're more likely to get those two recessive genes line up and show you what they've got. So the first principle of inbreeding is it shows you information. It gives you more information. Some of that's going to be good, some of that's going to be bad. No rat is perfect, and you have to accept that on that one. And then what you do is you use inbreeding or line breeding. There's different definitions for them, but essentially I'm going to stick with, they both mean breeding related rats together. It's all that we need to understand for this kind of thing. But by inbreeding, then what you need to do is to select to reinforce, double up on the traits you want, and select away from the traits you don't want. And you do that by selecting, if it's obvious, so if you've got a rat that's like a little bit of a sharp temperament, and one of its parents is lovely and sweet, and one of its parents is a bit sharp itself, you know, not perfect, not horrible, but you're not going to breed from a horrible rat, but one that kind of overreacts to certain situations, then in order to select you will use inbreeding to go more towards the parent's side, who was the chilled person, the kind of lovely relaxed rat. That's an obvious thing you can do. When it comes to health issues, it's a lot harder, because when I say you've got to select for improvements, you may not be able to see. So you might find that you're having a predisposition in one of your kind of strands of your line that tend to get more mammary tumours than others. But not every rat will get a mammary tumour, and actually when your rats are at breeding age, they're not going to be getting mammary tumours, or if they are, you've got real problems. But generally rats will get mammary tumours when they're older, later in life, older on. So what you've actually got to do then is pair this inbreeding up with really good record keeping, so you understand how many mammary tumours are getting from each litter, not just from the rats you bred on from, though obviously they are more important than their siblings, but the siblings also show the kind of genes that they've got going on too. And then you want to try and select for towards sides of your kind of line that has less of these incidences in. So gradually you're kind of trying to pull your genetic tendencies more and more towards the positive and away from those negative stuff. And it sounds kind of complicated, and in reality it is complicated, because whilst you're trying to sort out, let's say, reducing the amount of mammary tumours you've got in your line, you're also trying not to cause hormonal problems or respiratory problems or like nasty aggressive tumours that might not be showing up in your line, but as you slowly select for something, it can cause problems. For instance, a good one of this, when we started we had quite high mammary tumours in our line. I think it was around the 60% mark, which is actually what scientific experiments say all rats are at, but for us it was way too high. It's something we knew we needed to work on. And so we started selecting for, away from mammary tumours, so for rats that got them later and later in life. And also because there's quite a strong link between weight gain and mammary tumours, so a fat rat is more likely to have mammary tumours. Simple as that, you know. It's really important that you keep your rats slim. But as we selected towards rats that kept slimmer for longer but also had less mammary tumours, what we didn't realise was we accidentally selected for rats that tended towards slightly worse lactation, because the hormone that's involved in the growth of the mammary tumours is also involved in lactation. So we were selecting for rats that had less kind of high levels of this hormone, and we're starting to find lactation issues creeping up, and it's still something we're currently trying to correct and select in different ways, but these issues that we're dealing with are complicated. And we should never forget that. And even if we're just looking at one issue like that, you can create yourself some other problems by you select it as best you can, and you can only select from the output. You can't select based on a specific cause. So I couldn't select for whatever made mammary tumour, well, I could select for everything that made mammary tumours less likely, but not one specific thing very easily, other than the weight gain side of things. Which, to be fair, our rats also then tended to get a bit too skinny, so we've actually tried to select to balance that out a little bit. But at the same time as this mammary tumour thing's going on, we're also trying to make sure that we don't get any other issues creep in. So for a while we had a lot of abscesses popping up in the rats. They were quite weak against a particular bacteria called Pasteurella, very strong against myco, so we barely saw any proper respiratory problems, but they'd get a little bit nasally and snotty and such, and then they would get abscesses fairly commonly, so we're selecting away from that at the same time. That also worked. And guess what? We then got some epilepsy popped up, which had been nowhere in our lines. We'd never seen it before, and it came out of nowhere. But this is all things that by inbreeding we found was in there, so actually then we could actively select away from it. If we hadn't have inbred, we wouldn't have known, and it might have been that kind of epilepsy causing gene, and it's probably not a simple gene, but the kind of genetic tendency towards epilepsy, we wouldn't have known about it until it was widespread in the line. As it is, we found it, and then we very quickly actually basically abandoned that litter. I think there was one litter born on from that litter, and that was an outcross, and I'll talk about why you do outcrosses in that case in a little bit. But that's the really powerful thing. So we knew we had a problem that we hadn't known about before, and that's really, really valuable. So you kind of, it's back to the two things. Inbreeding gives you information. It lets you identify problems that you don't know about. It lets you identify strengths that you might not be aware of as well. But inbreeding needs to be paired with very careful collection of information. So you need information on the most number of rats you can. So not just the rats you keep, but the rats that you've homed to pet homes, and that's why it's really valuable. If you are a pet home watching this, you're a really valuable resource to a breeder. You genuinely help improve those lines by giving good information, by trying to keep your rats kind of in a consistent and good quality way as well, because what we found in the past when we were breeding away from mammary tumours, it was quite hard when there was a few people that tended to let their rats get overweight, and that would throw the facts, the kind of figures out for that litter a little bit. You had to take into account, right, okay, their rats normally are a bit chubby, so they are slightly more predisposed to it than the other rats, and actually they've got 2 from that litter but not from the others, and we'd have a few people like that, so we'd have to try and work that out. So do try and keep your rats slim to help give your breeders better information so they can improve the next generation too. But yes, so that pairing the kind of inbreeding with really good information and careful selection. And I will say there's different kinds of selection that you can do, and it gives you different levels of kind of like focus in on a particular thing. So what I spoke about before, where you've got parents of a particular rat, and they have offspring, and of those babies you might decide that you really want to maximise on the dad's side of things. And actually a really good breeding mating to do that would be to take one of the daughters and mate her back to her dad. It sounds really squicky and horrible as a human, but rats don't care, and actually they do it in the wild. It's kind of perfectly natural for them. But if we do take that daughter and mate her back to her dad, then she's effectively going to have, or her offspring are going to have double the information from dad than the original mum. And if mum had a problem, or actually dad was just awesome, either way the babies are going to be more similar genetically to dad, and that's really good. So you're kind of strengthening on that side. That's a very strong selection towards one parent. Then you get slightly looser ones. So we might have the kind of dad, but actually he's good but he's not perfect, but actually one of his brothers is also really good and he has slightly different faults to dad and slightly different bonuses, but they're still similar. So actually we should go kind of a niece to her uncle, and yes, that's the right way around. I always get confused with these relations, but yes, so effectively you're selecting back to the litter that dad came from, but not specifically to dad. So that litter might have lived really long, have really good health on average. So that's selecting slightly weaker towards dad. Actually, you're almost selecting more towards dad's parents and all his litter mates. And then you might say, go like another generation further and go for like second cousin. And then I just get like, they're all, for me, every rat that is of the same generation is cousins if they're not litter mates. It just makes it a lot easier to try and work out. But yeah, effectively, the closer kind of related to the kind of rat you're breeding you get, the harder the selection is towards that. And I should briefly mention brother and sister. So brother and sister is one that we sometimes use, and effectively with brother-sister mating, you're taking 2 rats from the same parents and you're doubling up on those parents. You're also doubling up on that litter generally. And what you're going to make is more options. You can select a little bit with that, but effectively you're going to make rats that have genetic material that's very similar to the litter that they came from, because they're both from the litter they came from. And that is, so I've used that before when I'm really short, so I've only got, let's say, a couple of rats from a litter, and they're a really important litter for some reason. Something about them makes them really useful. So what I could do is make mum and dad again, but actually I might choose not to do that. They might not be the right age, and actually I don't like duplicating a mating. I like to kind of make each mating different in some way, because that gives me better selection further down the line. But by doing a brother to sister and picking, let's say, my favourite brother and my favourite sister, I can create more of that and hopefully kind of get more options for the next generation. So that's your kind of inbreeding ones, main ways of inbreeding, and you'll do that each successive generation. And depending on the level of inbreeding you use, you'll get a kind of more and more similar kind of homogeneous, I think that's the right word. So you will get your kind of rats to be more and more similar. This comes with pros and cons. Pros, you really know them well. Cons, because they're getting more and more similar, and you might be doing, let's say, father to daughter or other very strong inbreedings generation after generation. The more similar they get, the less variety in the gene pool you have, which is really good if it's good stuff, but it means it's very difficult to kind of get that range of selection when you have a problem crop up, because actually by that point it is fairly unanimously in the kind of gene pool. So your options then are to try and gradually select away from it by selecting the rats that are least affected, but actually that is a very slow thing to do. And if you don't have if it's a very simple recessive, for instance, there is no way you get it back. Think of it like if you had a kind of line that was all black rats, there's no way you'll get a Agouti back into that. And the same goes if you've got a line, they're very, very similar rats that all have exactly the same genetic flaw. There is no way that you will stop that genetic flaw without adding new material in, which is an outcross effectively, or crossing to a related line, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So yes, by doing this kind of by doing the kind of really extreme inbreeding, you get very similar rats. And actually lab strains, they call them, and strain means that they're really, really inbred. There is an inbreeding coefficient, but I don't think that's particularly useful, and I don't remember it. Google it if you're interested. But if you get a really, really inbred strain, the rats are virtually genetically identical. Really useful from a science point of view because it means your experiments are repeatable. Not that useful from a breeder trying to select, because there isn't a range of kind of, you can't select because they're all the same. Effectively what you're selecting is just their effect of kind of the environment on them, or a particular parent, or that the fractional differences that is in the genetic code. So it's kind of, it is quite quite limited. Sorry, Worm is just hilarious. Aren't you the best little baby? Yes, you lick me on the nose. Yeah, sorry, slight diversion from a serious topic. The other thing you get with heavily inbred rats is you can get something called inbreeding depression. And what that effectively means is when you get like really inbred strains, and actually even as you're getting more inbred on like your current line, not to the strain point by any means, you'll notice that the fertility drops off. And that's just one of the kind of situations you get in. And so you'll get smaller litter sizes, and actually something we've noticed in ours, we've been breeding now for 9 years, and we have added in new material in that time, but most of our matings, and it's the same for most breeders that have been around this length of time, will have been an inbreed, and the litter sizes have dropped off. We tended to get litter sizes around about the 8 to 13, 14 region in the early days. Now we tend to get kind of like 5 to 10. 10 is quite a big litter for us now. It was on the smaller side before, and that's quite interesting. Yet when we do an outcross of some description, the litter size is massive, and anybody breeding from our rats will suddenly get kind of 13s to 15s again. When I say massive, massive for our line. I do know breeders that routinely get kind of 20s. Be careful, Book. Yes, so that's inbreeding. So there is some kind of limitations with it, but it is a useful tool in its own right. You've just got to respect and understand the tool. It's kind of like, it's how you use it, not what that tool actually is, that's the problem. And that's what we see in dogs. So what we've seen is people focusing on inbreeding and only selecting for particular traits, to the point where those traits have become so harsh that they actually disfigure the animal effectively. So like the short noses, the short stumpy legs, it doesn't let them be the animal anymore. One thing that I really like actually about rat fancy in the UK, and I suspect it's similar elsewhere, is the standards are written to try and preserve the rat as an animal so that it can be a rat. So you've got to have kind of like good length of body so they can be fit and agile, good muscle covering, and they should be racy. They should have lovely big eyes so you don't get down to kind of pinprick eyes, nice big ears. It's one we have to watch as a fancy, and it's one as each breeder we need to watch as well. We need to make sure that our rats can still be rats first, otherwise we shouldn't be breeding them really, we're breeding toys then. But yes, so we need to make sure that our rats are able to be rats, and the standard when you're kind of showing helps you do that, as does good judges that understand what's actually important in there and don't just look at the words on a page. But currently we seem to be doing fairly well. It's definitely one we need to actively watch. Right, so that's inbreeding. Now we're going to go into outcrossing. Outcrossing is another tool. Some people will say never go to a breeder that outcrosses because it's all entirely random. And actually it is entirely random to a point. There's some countries out there where outcrossing is the norm. They won't consider inbreeding because they think they're going to store themselves up a load of problems. And some countries where outcrossing is seen as evil, and so on. In reality, both are useful tools, and no breeder should discard either from their kind of repertoire as such. So what outcrossing does is it's effectively you're bringing two unrelated rats together, and you get a whole host of kind of genes. So their genetic information is probably not similar, but you will effectively, you can select for traits, much like you can with inbreeding. The problem is you're selecting from two rats that are very, very different, and you're only selecting for what you can see. So it's quite random what you get that lined up. It's like when you're inbreeding, you're throwing a 4-sided dice, and when you're outcrossing, you're throwing 4 or 5 6-sided dice or 12-sided dice or something. There's a lot more options out there, an awful lot more. The kind of dice analogy is far too kind of small. But when you're outcrossing, it's like the genetic lottery as such. Any number, like series of numbers, could come up, and that is useful if you have like problems in a line. So how I tend to do things is I will inbreed for a period of time, and then when I have something that is either so bad that I want to quickly select away from it, I can't afford for more rats to be born in that situation, or where I don't think I've got the means of fixing that within my current line, then I will outcross, because outcrossing will bring in a whole host of new genes. I won't know what all of them are. Some of them will be good, some of them will be bad. It's like kind of like rolling that dice, picking the kind of lottery balls. Some of them will be good that you get out of it, and some stuff will be bad. Some kind of, it's really quite interesting. Some outcrosses really work, and you'll get it, and it will really mesh. The kind of rats will mesh well together. You'll get beautiful rats out of it. It'll help with a certain health problem that you're trying to kind of reduce or eliminate. Everything will work really, really well. And then some outcrosses will be shit, and the two rats, even though they're really complementary on the surface, they'll cause temperament problems. You'll get health issues that neither line has seen before, that have just kind of cropped up by crossing the two lines together. It can be an absolute nightmare. And that's the kind of thing with outcrossing. It is risky. You roll a dice, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And that's where outcrossing is very useful, but it's something that needs to be done carefully. Because whilst you kind of may not see issues on the first generation, as you kind of either inbreed on that, or actually if you outcross endlessly, you may end up with that issue spread through an entire kind of massive group of rats until it's a whole population that's suddenly got this issue that you're trying to avoid. You didn't know you had. You made the best selections you could, but a lot of the selections were based blind, so you couldn't see that problem was there. So what you would tend to do in a really responsible way of outcrossing is have your line, you've got your line, and then you have this problem identified, so you outcross, and you outcross to another line that you don't think has the same problems but has some of the same strengths as yours, and that's quite important because you still want to double up on the strengths. Everything is double up on what you want to keep and try and select away from, so minimize any like the contact with that problem as far as you can. So you're moving away from what you don't want and moving towards what you want. It's very simple. That is the fundamentals of breeding. So with your outcross, you're selecting for someone with similar kind of positive traits that you can see, and hopefully they've kept really good records of their lines, so they can tell you about the health traits as well, so you can see what they will add from that point of view, and make sure that you don't have the same weaknesses in your line, because all lines have weaknesses. So then you kind of double up on the good stuff, move away from the bad stuff, and then you will see what happens. And actually, while you're doing that, you will continue running your line, keep it going, and keep the outcross separate, so that you've still got some of the original line to move back to. And that's really important, because what you may find, I've often said, you don't really know a line until you're 3 to 5 generations in. And actually probably more like the 5 generations, because then the third generation will be getting older, and that is also on the basis that you're not breeding really young. So I breed around 9 to 12 months on average from a first litter. Used to be a little bit later, moved a little bit earlier, just because we lost a few rats because they fertiled out as such. So by the time I'm on my 3rd generation, the first generation is well into old age, if not kind of dead of various ailments. By the time I'm on the 5th generation, I've got 3 or 4 generations, or 2 or 3 generations worth of good data, like full lifespan data. So then I'm beginning to know the line, and it's the same with an outcross. When you outcross, you effectively create a new subline, and that subline is will have its own characteristics, and you need to learn that in its own right. So keep them separate for a period of time, and then when you're happy with it, you can either let your kind of if your old line has major problems, you could let that go, or you could start merging them and kind of embed them more. So what you can do is your outcross line is you can still cross back to your original line, and actually you can still cross back to the place you got that outcross from, depending how you want to select which direction you want to go in, what you want to get from each mating. But it's really important that you kind of keep that and don't pollute all of your line or all of the outcross line, so you kind of understand what's going. And stuff will happen. That's kind of like the best way to do things. Sometimes things happen and you lose your original line, and you just have to work with what you've got from the outcross line. And kind of shit happens. Life is not necessarily going to plan. In fact, most of the time it doesn't go to plan. But that kind of gives you an idea of what you should aim for. One option that really should be mentioned with outcrossing, and it's my preference, and it's something that I'd say when you do need to outcross, so when you genuinely don't have something within your current line and you need to outcross, look to see what related lines you've got. So as a breeder, and I think it's really important that we all do this as breeders, I will help support other breeders, and I will give them rats from my line to use in theirs. I mean, I do try and make sure that they kind of good breeders. They're going to do justice by the rats and going to treat them well and such, for obvious reasons. But the act of kind of helping them out with their lines, they may need something as an outcross, and I give them my rats to do that, and I've obviously got a lot of information that can provide them on that. But that also is really good from my perspective, because when I do need an outcross, guess where I go to first? I go to the people that have already done part of the work for me. Sometimes we've not been able to do that and we've had to just go for a kind of full outcross. But nowadays, like 9-10 years in, most of our outcross options are out there. So Sol and Eclipse that you've met in the previous video that I did on books, they're both a partial outcross. So I sent a doe off down to Halcyon, way down in Norfolk, quite a long trek. She gave Lisa a litter down there, and then I think these are the grandchildren of that doe were sent down. So I needed an outcross because we found this issue in terms of lactation in our line. And Lisa doesn't have that problem in her line, and actually the down line from my doe that I sent down there that did interestingly have that lactation issue has gone away. So she seems to have fixed it because she had good lactation in her line. So now I'm got 2 books back from that, and I'm going to cross them into my line, hopefully, in the next few weeks, assuming the rats cooperate, which they rarely do. We already know this. But yes, so that will be my outcross, and it'll be a partial outcross. She's been running that line kind of for, it's basically 50-50 Isaru and Halcyon, so that's really useful, and hopefully that will help give us the kind of resolution that we need. In the meantime, we're working on still inbreeding our line, but selecting within that for rats that have no lactation issues, like Foo here. So Foo's of the same kind of line. It's a reasonably broad line, there's a few different strands going on in it. But Foo's mum had no lactation issues, Foo had no lactation issues. The book that she had the Lumen babies, who are kind of worm that you saw earlier, and Bug, their dad didn't have any lactation issues. So we're still working through on the kind of line on that side, but we've also outcrossed to give ourselves options, and we will run that kind of Halcyon Isami line along for a little bit longer, but it's meshing very well over at Halcyon, so it bodes really well for this now. And that is also good because I know that line works together fairly well from the evidence that we've seen so far. Yeah, we want a few more generations before we really know it very well. But by going to a partial outcross, you basically shorten the amount of time that is needed to really know whether that outcross works or not. So it's a very useful thing to do, and it's something that if you've got that option, go for it. You may find that you don't have that option. Either you've not kind of got a defined line yourself yet, and you have to outcross to start with. Just trying to work out what the hell Chocobow's doing, which appears to be eating wire, you weirdo. Sorry, she's up there, up on the cat tree, just pulling the plastic off wire. But yes, so that is kind of outcrossing. What I should also mention with outcrossing, your ultimate outcrossing is kind of your pet shop lines. They're basically just churned out. There will be actually probably a fair bit of inbreeding in there, but it's uncontrolled inbreeding, so they're not selecting for anything other than perhaps interesting colours. They won't be doing it with the basis of any information, because of course if you sold a rat from a pet shop, then you don't have any information from the pet homes because they just don't feed back. There's no requirement to do that. And generally speaking, there will be a lot more kind of outcrossing. They're genetic lotteries. They're complete randomness with kind controlled inbreeding thrown in just for extra problems. So I should say, when you do see problems with inbreeding, it tends to be around when it's uncontrolled, so you can get things like missing toes and such because they're not carefully selecting for kind of really good quality rats, and it's not a good idea. If you're going to use inbreeding and you don't use selection, it's a dangerous thing, because you're just doubling up on all the problems. But if you use it with selection, then it's a useful tool. But yeah, I got distracted off my outcrossing thing. What I should mention is, when you do your first outcross, you will generally find, usually I should say, that litter does really well, and that's called hybrid vigour. It's a known phenomenon, I can't even say that word, and it's something that is something that we've seen when we've done kind of outcrosses, and it's quite irregular. You'll find the generation afterwards does really well, and that is because genuinely that kind of like initial kind of outcross, there shouldn't be any real lined up genes, or very few. You know, it's not going to be a kind of like, there's not going to be many genes that line up, that double up, so that they're actually not going to have very many health problems and such, because at this stage it's all entirely random. It's when you get those two kind of issues lining up that you start seeing them in the rats. But in reality, all those rats carry whatever problems you don't know about. So whilst they look to be doing really well, don't judge it off that first generation, because it will look good. They will generally probably live a decent amount of time. They're probably not going to get as many health problems as usual. You do need to inbreed a little bit to find out whether it's actually worked or not. And it's the same, you may, if you do outcrossing again and again, several generations, you'll probably see that it's going quite well. Then you'll start getting things kind of creeping in as the population gets more kind of saturated with whatever problem is that you can't see. So hybrid vigour is a thing. Outcrossing regularly, like I said, with the kind of opposite with inbreeding, you'll generally get bigger litters as well. But yes, so those are the kind of side effects of outcrossing. And outcrossing indefinitely is effectively what you get in the wild, to a point. Though I will say, you will still get communities within a certain area that are actually fairly related. But they do try and kind of select things. And in the wild, it makes a lot of sense, because what you need to do well in the wild is a lot of dice rolls. So you need to be lucky, effectively. And it makes a lot of sense in the wild that the environment isn't controlled. Things are changing day to day. They're a lot more susceptible to kind of viruses, bacteria, etc. So by rolling that kind of lottery with masses of dice, it works really well in the wild, because you're going to hit it lucky on a few of the rats, and those rats will then reproduce, and weirdly enough that selection factor will come in. And actually, if you've got a particular kind of downline of rats that are resistant to something, they'll probably start inbreeding naturally, because there won't be any other rats to breed with. But that's effectively how it kind of works. But yeah, hopefully that's been interesting. It's really just kind of to recap. There is no evil in either tool. Inbreeding and outcrossing both have their place. You need to use them carefully, and you need to use them with understanding. Inbreeding, make sure you're doing it with positive selection. So understand, keep good records, understand the health side of things. Make sure you're selecting towards the good stuff. So double up on what you see that is good. So both parents carry that trait, or both parents' families carry that trait. And select away from, or don't double up on the faults. So every rat will have a fault, every rat's family will have a fault, so don't mate two rats who have the fault, or their kind of immediate family has the faults together if you can help it. General rule for everything. Keep good records, like I say, so you can make the good decisions. Realise that you're not going to get really good data until you're 3, 4, 5 generations in, and you've had a couple of generations at least pass on. That will give you far more information. I'd say, yeah, about 3 generations passed on, and you're starting to really understand your line. What I will say, because I see this happen a lot with particularly new breeders, and I did exactly the same when I was a new breeder, is don't decide on a litter too early. So what you do kind of see quite a lot is in a big litter, say you've got 13 rats, you'll get some shit luck at the start. So you'll get maybe 2 or 3 rats that die younger than your average. They have health problems that have cropped up and they're fairly early, and you'll be like, oh my god, that litter's awful. I've got a rat with a mammary tumour at 18 months, or two or three mammary tumours at 18 months, and that rat dropped dead, and oh my god, I can't breed on from that litter, it's terrible. But actually what you've got is another 9 rats that are doing really well, and then what you'll probably end up finding is you decided not to breed from that litter, and then it gets to their everybody else lives to their 27 months, and then you start seeing some of them die, but actually they're aging really well. Nobody's had a mammary tumour since then, it was a complete fluke. And actually you get some that live to 32 months, and you've been beating yourself up about this terrible, terrible litter, but actually you've only seen a snapshot of it. So don't make your mind up about a litter straight away. Leave your options open, but do it carefully. And it's where, if you're really worried about a litter, books are very handy, because books have a longer kind of usability window. You can use a book when they're 18 months, 24 months. Usually they're not always that interested in does. That can be a bit of a pain, but that is quite handy. If you're genuinely really worried about a litter, then using the books when they're slightly older is useful. Quick note on that. I'm really going off topic here, aren't I? Yeah, quick note on that. As books get older, because of the way the sperm forms, the sperm will basically divides all the way through the life to create more and more sperm. So it's constantly kind of dividing up. And the more divisions that it does, the more chance of something completely random coming up, is some sort of mutation cropping up. So the older the book is that you're breeding from, the kind of more chance of some random variables cropping up. Just basically, when I say mutations, I don't mean it's going to grow an extra ear. I mean that there might be something that means that it's more susceptible to certain cancers, or less susceptible. It's a dice roll. I think I mentioned it in selecting the parent side of things, but that is useful to bear in mind. But yeah, don't make up your mind with a litter too early. Try and keep your options open, unless there's something that's really bad. And for us, that was like the epilepsy thing we found. We decided that we were only going to outcross from that litter, and actually, because the doe I kept, which is Fing, who's currently eating in the cage, she's an old lady now, she didn't want to get pregnant even to an outcross. We literally only have one mating on from that litter. Weirdly, apart from the 2 rats with epilepsy from it, it's doing really well. So yeah, even though I'm an experienced breeder, I still write off litters quite early on because shit that's happened. But epilepsy is a pretty nasty one as these things go. Thankfully it's not cropped up again. We seem to have kind of got to the root cause of it, which may well have been mum not drinking her calcibet in the cage, which would be very annoying if that was the case, but actually we've got no way of particularly being sure right now. But yes, now I've got off that really random diversion. Yeah, use inbreeding properly, use it with care. Understand it. Outcrossing is the exact same. Understand that it is a roll of the dice. It is very much introducing unknowns into your kind of rat line, and that can be good or it can be bad. Use it when you need to add new stuff in, when you don't currently have it in your line, or when things are too serious that you can't afford for any more of these issues to show up in your line. And what's too serious is a personal choice, very much a personal choice. And you'll find that what's too serious when you're starting out, oh, that's my ear trouble. You know, what you may find when you're starting out, what seems too serious is actually quite different when you get kind of a bit more experienced about breeding it and you see more of the issues, and actually also more of the good that can come from kind of litters that appear to be doing shit. But yes, so that's kind of my advice really. Hopefully that's useful. Hopefully you understood the waffle about different levels of inbreeding and such. Hopefully it's also demystified things a bit so that you understand that how to use them and that neither are evil, like I've said. So that's probably it, and over and out from me, and apologies for a long waffly video.